Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Tonight, in his State of the Union, Joe Biden must answer for his failed leadership, whether it's the border crisis continuing to rage at our southern border, crushing inflation and over $30 trillion in national debt, or a balloon from communist China entering into the United States sovereign airspace. Joe Biden has caused a crisis in America. This is why Americans spoke clearly in November. Our families cannot afford Joe Biden's failed far-left Democrat policies. In the new House Republican majority, we have already hit the ground running, working on behalf of the American people to provide critical checks and oversight on the Biden administration and deliver on our legislative agenda, the commitment to America, an economy that's strong, a nation that's safe, a future that's built on freedom, and a government that's accountable. In just the first few weeks, we have reopened the People's House, defended America's energy security, protected the sanctity of life, defunded Joe Biden's IRS army, ended Joe Biden's COVID-19 power grab, and established select committees to address the Chinese Communist Party's malign influence and the weaponization of the federal government. As Joe Biden makes our nation less safe with his failed far-left policies, I am honored to highlight the important work of our upstate New York law enforcement by inviting Montgomery County Sheriff Jeff Smith as my State of the Union guest this evening. House Republicans will continue to hold Joe Biden accountable and deliver on our promises to the American people. And as we've been doing every week, we are highlighting our newly elected freshman members. And that freshman member today is Monica De La Cruz from Texas's 15th District.
Thank you, Elise. Good morning. I'd like to briefly touch upon the border crisis in communities like mine as a result of this administration's weak border policies. Since Joe Biden took office, we've had over 5 million illegal crossings. There is nothing compassionate about weak border policies. They fuel human trafficking by incentivizing millions of migrants to risk their lives in dangerous journeys to our beautiful country. President Biden's failed border policy is not just a humanitarian crisis, it is a public safety threat as well. As a mother of 2 teens, the number of American parents who have had empty chairs at their dinner table at this holiday season because of overdoses is absolutely heartbreaking and shocking. I hope the president takes this issue more seriously and commits to getting Border Patrol agents the resources that they need to protect our families. Because let me be clear, South Texans do not want open borders. And I'll say that in Spanish as well, because there is often a misconception that Hispanics like these policies. Well, we do not. Queremos una frontera seguro. Las fronteras abiertas son peligrosos para inmigrantes y nuestras familias. Thank you. And I now pass it to my colleague, Jason Smith.
Thank you, Ms. Monica. The American people, they don't need to be lectured about our State of the Union. Instead, Republicans want to listen to them. That's why yesterday, the House Ways and Means Committee on their first hearing loaded up a bus and went to Petersburg, West Virginia, to a sawmill to listen directly to the American voices of the issues that they're facing, whether it's the inflation crisis, the debt crisis, the interest rate crisis, or the energy crisis. Ashley Bachman, a mom of 3 and an owner of a local restaurant, testified. She told us that her restaurant has been bleeding money due to all the interest costs as a direct result of Biden's inflation crisis. She also told us how difficult it is for her to keep a workforce of 35 employees because she's competing with the government who gives them more benefits than what they can earn. Wiley McDade, co-owner of the local distillery, talked about how painful, and that was his word, of the supply chain logistics remaining today. Jamie Ward, a 30-year coal industry worker, summed up it well when he said it's time for the federal government to do its part by lowering the cost rural Americans are forced to pay every day just to stay alive. These are real Americans. This is the state of their union, and that's the state of the economy. These are the voices House Republicans are listening to, because we made a commitment to build an economy that's strong, and that means prioritizing our country's most valuable resource, the American worker. It means reining in reckless spending that has increased $10 trillion since Joe Biden's taken the oath of office. It means securing our supply chains. It means growing wages for everyday Americans. I'm honored to stand with my colleagues as we make sure that the voice of the president is not allowed to drown out the voice of America's working families. I'm pleased to yield to the great gentleman from the great state of Utah, Mr. Burgess Owens.
Thank you. My story is symbolic of that told by millions upon millions of Americans whose lineage had humble beginnings, those whose ancestors fought through tremendous struggles, but due to their vision and tenacity, experienced the promise of freedom. My great-great-grandfather, Silas Burgess, came to this country in the belly of the slave ship. Generations of dreamers later, I'm blessed to serve in the highest levels of government. America from its beginning has been the beacon of hope, opportunity, and freedom. The House Republican majority has made a pledge in its commitment to America to keep it that way. We'll start by teaching our children the blessings of living in a land of the free and home of the brave. We'll teach the concept of freedom is unique within the American DNA, put there by a freedom-loving God. We'll legislate, empowering our children to once again dream big, giving them the opportunity to make their parents proud by succeeding and running circles around them. We believe in a future built on freedom. Freedom from democratic-driven lockdowns and entrapment of children in failing schools, where only union bosses thrive. Freedom as a parent from being targeted by a federal government or counsel for advocating for their children's education. Freedom to choose a school that's best to fit the students' needs. A choice made by parents who love their children, supported by teachers who love their profession. Freedom is a commitment from the Republican House majority. With an educated, engaged, we the people, and guidance from a loving Heavenly Father, we will keep our promise. Thank you, and I yield to my good friend, Jim Jordan.
We've had now dozens of whistleblowers come talk to House Republican staff on the Judiciary Committee. In fact, one of them is testifying in a transcribed interview as we speak, talking about how the Justice Department is now operating in such a political fashion and manner. Second, you all know about the Twitter files, where we have learned that big tech, big government are colluding to keep information from we the people. The most egregious example took place prior to the 2020 presidential election, where they kept that information from the country just days and weeks before the most important election we have, suppressing a story and limiting Americans' free speech rights. And then finally, third, when I think about the accountability that we plan to bring to this administration, I just think in the broad sense. I mean, everything has gotten worse. In 2 years' time, we went from a secure border to no border. We went from safe streets to record crime. We went from stable prices to record inflation. And of course, as I've said, we have a government that now I believe is targeting the very people it is supposed to serve. So we plan on, as a Republican majority, holding them accountable and dealing with what we have seen. And again, what has been exposed from the Twitter files and, of course, what these brave FBI agents who've come to us now as whistleblowers and told us how the Justice Department is operating and how it is not supposed to be functioning in that manner, because it is supposed to be equal treatment under the law in this great country. I now want to turn it over to the Majority Whip, the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer.
Thank you, Jim.
Tonight, we'll undoubtedly hear dizzying spin from Joe Biden as he attempts to tell the American people they're better off now than they were when he took office 2 years ago. But the fact remains, at the first chance they were given, American voters elected a Republican House majority to counteract Joe Biden's failed agenda. An agenda that has brought about 2 years of crisis after crisis, disaster after disaster. Tonight, Biden can try to gaslight on the economy and inflation. He can try to tell the American people they are not struggling financially. I'll remind the president that inflation surged to a 40-year high under his failing leadership, with economic experts blaming his policy. By the way, his own economic experts blaming his policies. I will also remind him that American families are struggling to pay their grocery bills and they're maxing out their credit cards. This is not economic success. Biden can try to deflect on the border crisis his policies have caused. I will remind the president that since he took office, there have been nearly 5 million illegal crossings at our southern border, and fentanyl deaths are surging, facts which he conveniently ignored until it became evident there was a new House majority in town to hold his administration accountable. Biden can try to claim our nation is respected on the world stage. I will remind the president that this nation has not forgotten his botched Afghanistan withdrawal. And I'm sure I don't need to remind him that the entire nation watched just this week as he failed to stand up to our number one adversary, China, while they collected intelligence across the entire continental United States. These are just a few of the numerous failings of his administration. There are, unfortunately, far too many to count. No amount of spin this evening will change the reality so many Americans are facing. They are worse off now than they were 2 years ago. That is a fact. Luckily, Americans elected a Republican House majority to stop this madness. House Republicans are laser focused on delivering results, as you've heard from these members today, and we're bringing Joe Biden and Senate Democrats, if they choose, along with us as we put an end to radical policies that govern, and as we govern for, as Chairman Smith said, as we govern for the American people. And with that, I turn it over to our majority leader, Steve Scalise from Louisiana.
Thank you, Whip. Emmer. The state of our union is struggling under the weight of President Biden's far-left extremist agenda that is hurting families across this country. You can see it when people go to the gas station and pay 40% more to fill up their cars. It's not just at the pump. Their household electricity bills are through the roof. When they go to the grocery store, they're paying dramatically more for food because of President Biden's extremist agenda and radical spending. He may talk tonight about the debt ceiling, and of course, the debt ceiling is a symptom of Washington's spending problem under Joe Biden. Trillions in new spending that he's brought up. And to do what? Hundreds of billions of dollars President Biden borrowed to pay people not to work. Now think about paying people not to work at a time when every small business owner is looking for workers. It's not just bad spending policy to borrow from our children to pay people not to work, but President Biden's agenda of paying people not to work undermines Social Security. Because when he's borrowing money to pay people to sit at home, again, hundreds of billions of dollars he's borrowed to pay people not to work, those are people that aren't working who would otherwise be paying into Social Security. So President Biden's agenda has actually made Social Security less stable. We want to reverse that radical agenda. Republicans have already started getting to work, bringing forth an agenda focused on those families, fighting for the families who are struggling, to get our economy back on track, to bring energy security again, to secure America's border. In fact, we have multiple committees working on all of those items as we speak, and in the weeks ahead, you'll see bills coming to the floor to address those problems. We've already started bringing bills to the floor to address some of those problems. In fact, a few of them have produced bipartisan votes. But I want to point out an interesting vote last week. Maria Elvira Salazar brought a resolution that should have been straightforward to everybody to reject socialism and the ills of socialism through the years and the decades. The millions of people who have lost their lives to atrocities from socialism. Do you know that 100 Democrats refused to reject socialism by not voting for Maria Elvira Salazar's bill? That should tell people. And look, a lot of Democrats across this country can easily stand up and reject socialism. But I think they'd be shocked to know that Democrats in Washington, 100 of them, refuse to reject socialism. When we bring bill after bill to fix these problems, you see so many Democrats sitting on the sideline. We're going to give them more opportunities this week to stand up for hardworking families. In fact, when you look at crime out of control in so many communities, the District of Columbia's council passed an ordinance that dropped mandatory minimum penalties on criminals who commit violent crimes. For example, carjacking. We see carjacking and other violent crimes through the roof in D.C., and yet the council voted to get rid of those mandatory minimum sentences to let more violent criminals back out on the streets. It was so bad that the mayor of D.C. vetoed the ordinance. But the District of Columbia's council overrode that veto. And so now you see even more lenient sentences, no minimums for violent criminals. So we're bringing a resolution to reject that action by the D.C. Council. And this is a resolution that has powerful teeth, because if it passes the House and passes the Senate, only needs 51 votes to pass the Senate, it would go to Joe Biden's desk, and if he signed it, that council ordinance would be reversed. I'd be curious to see what the president would do if that bill was on his desk. All we need is 2 Democrat senators to stand up for people who don't want to become victims of crime and say that they would vote for that bill. And by doing that, once we pass this bill through the House, if it gets through the Senate and is signed by the president, it would overturn that ordinance. There's another bill we're bringing this week, Thursday, to say that we would reverse an ordinance that the D.C. Council passed that allows illegals to vote in District of Columbia elections. In fact, the Washington Post came out against this action and said, by their estimate, 50,000 illegals would be able to vote. People at the Chinese embassy would be able to vote in D.C. elections. How ludicrous is that? And yet that's the law of the land in D.C. unless we reverse it. So we're going to bring legislation to reverse that action as well. I'm curious to see how my Democrat colleagues in the House will vote, and then ultimately how the Senate will vote as well, because those bills could end up on President Biden's desk to solve real problems. So my guest tonight is going to be Dr. Jerry Satanovich. Dr. Satanovich is the coroner of my home parish, Jefferson Parish, a parish of about 430,000 people. Last year, he unfortunately was the one that had to diagnose and record the deaths of almost 300 young people from fentanyl. Almost 300 of our young people just in my home parish. Now, for perspective, when he took office 10 years ago, the number of fentanyl deaths were 2. 2 people died 10 years ago from fentanyl deaths. Last year, almost 300 young people were taken because of this open southern border. This open border under President Biden has had devastating consequences for families all across America. Today alone in America, almost 200 of our young people will die because of the fentanyl coming across our open southern border, because Joe Biden refuses to take action. It's why Jim Jordan's committee and Dr. Green's committee are taking action to bring border security legislation to the House floor. But we don't need to wait for Congress to take action. Joe Biden could reverse this today by signing executive actions to protect those young people from dying, but he won't do it. Every single day, yesterday, today, tomorrow, 200 young people will die. And this president won't take any action. I wonder if he'll talk about those deaths tonight, if he'll talk about the devastation to those families and every community in America who's experiencing this. So, Dr. Satanovich will be here to talk about it. Unfortunately, he's the one that has to talk to those parents. He shouldn't have to if Joe Biden did his job. With that, we'll be happy to take some questions. Yeah. President Biden has basically looked at every American as an opportunity for somebody to raise taxes on. When he doubled the size of the IRS with 87,000 IRS agents, the CBO confirmed, they've pretty much got one IRS agent dedicated to each billionaire in America. So they're already paying their taxes. In fact, they've got teams of attorneys and accountants to figure out the tax code in America. What President Biden wants to do is go after people making under $200,000, under $100,000. We gave them an opportunity, by the way, to protect those hardworking families from seeing their taxes go up, and Democrats blocked every effort. When the bill was going through to raise taxes multiple times last Congress, We had an amendment to say, for example, President Biden's campaign promise, nobody making under $400,000 will pay a dime in new taxes. You remember that statement. He said it over and over again. The problem is it wasn't true because we had an amendment to say what Biden himself promised, that nobody under $400,000 will pay a dime in new taxes. Do you know every Democrat blocked that amendment? That amendment did not get on the bill. He wants those single moms working 2 jobs at a restaurant somewhere to pay more in taxes because that's what will happen under his legislation, and CBO confirmed it. So what I would say to President Biden is stop going after these hardworking families who are struggling under the weight of his far-left policies. Let's try to get the burden of the federal government off people so that they can go experience the freedom and opportunity everybody deserves. Yeah. No, I'm talking about all the policies that were working just 2 years ago. You know, day one, he stopped construction of the wall. Was still paying the contractors, but made them abandon the work site. He got rid of the MPP protocol, the Remain in Mexico protocol that was working. It was an agreement President Trump had gotten with the president of Mexico to say if somebody wants to seek asylum, asylum is really at the heart of a lot of the flood of people coming over every single day, to say that if you've got a valid asylum claim, you've got to remain in Mexico while you do that. He actually got Mexico to protect their own southern border. And Mexico was doing that. That was stopping a lot of the flow. And immediately, day one, Joe Biden got rid of all those policies. So he can restore the things that were working. He just refuses to. So we're taking action to bring legislation to secure our border. Yeah, there were a number of, first of all, we set up a bipartisan commission on China, and Chairman Gallagher is already going to work with that committee. But there's standing committees that have jurisdiction as well. Yesterday I was meeting with some of the chairs of committees who are working on privacy legislation. You want to talk about a way to confront, whether it's TikTok, whether it's so many other social media platforms that are collecting data on Americans every single day, and how to counter that. I think there are real bipartisan opportunities to pass strong privacy protections for Americans. But the spy balloon is a different problem. And this is a national security threat that was a test. You know, and President Biden tried to call it a success that they shot the balloon down over the ocean. The problem is it was the wrong ocean they shot it down over. The Atlantic, it should have been the Pacific Ocean. You can look at the trajectory of that balloon, and when the American government detected it, there were many opportunities over the Pacific Ocean to shoot it down before it could actually carry out its mission. It completed its mission. President Biden let it complete its mission before he shot it down. And it went over many military bases. It wasn't some random path that it took through the United States. It was very specific, through a number of very sensitive military bases that it flew over. And this idea that, oh, don't worry, it wasn't collecting data or sending it back to China, how can anybody say that with a straight face? First of all, it was still flying on its path. So it was getting some kind of data from somewhere to know where to go. Are you telling me it wasn't also sending information back during that path? It should have never been allowed to complete its mission. It should have never been allowed to start its mission. It should have been shot down over the Pacific Ocean when we had multiple opportunities. Yeah. If you look at the economy, when President Biden walked in the door, it was juiced and ready to take off. You saw a lot of states that were already opening up, and some of my colleagues are from states like Florida, Texas, where they had already opened up their economy. In fact, millions of people are going to those states because they wanted freedom. They wanted to flee this kind of oppressive socialist-type government that was shutting them down and keeping them in their houses or driving in their cars by themselves with 3 masks on, and the lunacy of some of those policies. And so you saw some of those states already taking off. And in the economy, you had every employer in America looking for workers when Joe Biden took office. And what was his first action? To pass a $1.7 trillion bill that borrowed money to pay people not to work, to keep people in their houses when the economy was ready to take off. You saw an energy policy when Joe Biden took office where we didn't need to rely on foreign nations for our energy, and he immediately, day one, took action to shut down American energy. He wasn't against all energy. He was just against American energy. Killed the Keystone Pipeline, but approved Russia's pipeline. Killed projects and sat on permits and leases in the United States while he begged Putin and then ultimately other countries, going to Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, begging them to produce oil while he was killing oil in America. Those were all things that were happening the day Joe Biden took office. And then as he started taking those actions, spending trillions of dollars to pay people not to work, to keep the economy shut down, you then saw dramatic devastation happen. Energy prices through the roof, inflation through the roof, a supply chain crisis. We've seen crisis after crisis just at the Department of Transportation. And yet, no action taken. They just sit back and let it happen. A balloon flies over the United States collecting data over every military base in America, and the president just sits by. Says he gave the order on Wednesday to shoot it down, but it didn't get shot down on Saturday. Did he send it through the mail service? Who did he give the order to? I thought he was the commander-in-chief. Has anybody asked the president that question? If you really gave an order to shoot down a spy plane from China on Wednesday and it didn't happen till Saturday, have you fired every single person that refused to obey the commander-in-chief's order? Those are the things that happened under Joe Biden. Yeah. We're working on legislation right now dealing with the Chinese spy balloon. There's 4 different committees involved, and so as you can imagine, each committee is working through. We haven't even had the classified briefings yet. You know, the Gang of 8 briefing that was supposed to be had hasn't yet been called yet. We're trying to get a full briefing with all of the members of Congress. Speaker McCarthy has asked for a full briefing of all members of Congress to find out what really happens. So we're still gathering more facts, working through that process. So we may have a piece of legislation, but it's not finalized yet. Thank you all. We'll see you all tonight and talk to you afterwards. One more question. Why not? Debt and nerve. Well, we've got debt experts here, and people that know how to get out of debt is more important. Well, first of all, if you go back through time, there's always been a conversation about the debt ceiling, and it's around the time that the spending happens. And many of the reforms to spending that have helped control spending, that have gotten us to balanced budgets, have all been a part of a debt ceiling negotiation. President Biden himself, when he was a United States Senator, talked about that when he voted against one of the debt ceilings years ago. So you can go watch that tape. We'll get it to you. If not, PBS probably has it. So ultimately, if you look at what should be on the table, the debt ceiling today is maxed out because President Biden and Speaker Pelosi and Chuck Schumer went on a spending binge like the country has never seen, trillions of dollars over the last 2 years, and they didn't pay for it. They had the opportunity to pay for it when they were spending, and they didn't. They dumped it on this new Congress, and so we are going to deal with it responsibly. We want to make sure that as we're talking about the credit card of the nation being maxed out by Joe Biden, we also talk about how to get control over spending so that we can start living within our means, just like families have. Families have this conversation every month when they look at their credit card bill. They don't just ask for a new credit card and go max it out. They talk about how they can actually get control so they're not in the spot again. That's what we should be doing. Thank you. See you tonight.